That Friday morning, as the cops filed into our office to talk with my boss, I began to feel a little betrayed by my job. Look, I'm not good with people. Well, at least not face to face. Now I can handle them over the phone because, hey, if the interaction goes wrong, I can always hang up, right? But when it comes to dealing with people personally, let's just say it's not my forte. Which is why I worked at the dispatch office in the first place. I mostly sat by myself all day and answered the phone. What could be better than that? Until some prick had to go and ruin it. As my boss came out to talk to the officers, I noticed that one of the cops, a young one, with a handlebar mustache and an aura of frigid indifference, surveyed all of us hapless dispatchers, chained to our desks by the promise of a paycheck. I followed his gaze around my co-workers, feeling a little like a snoop, as my eyes fell on each person in turn. Seated towards my left was Shannon. She was a few years younger than me, a pretty punk rocker sort of girl with short hair and heavy eyeliner. She always answered phones with an energetic kind of voice that bubbled up from some secret reserve inside her. I was a little jealous of her enthusiasm. I'd never had that in my life, if I'm being honest. Next to her was Samantha. Samantha was basically Shannon's opposite, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She was good at her job, but she didn't handle problem customers very well. Every time someone screamed at her over the phone, she'd devolve into tears, and one of us would have to comfort her. That job usually fell to me, which is hilarious in and of itself, because I'm terrible at empathizing with people. Then we have Eric. If I had to pick anyone that I liked in the office, it was him. He didn't interact with people. I mean, if social protocol absolutely dictated it, then he might grunt a hello to us in the morning. Otherwise, he sat at his desk, answered calls, and pretended we weren't there. That suited me just fine. If I could, I'd get rid of all social interaction that wasn't absolutely necessary. Finally, seated to my right, was George. He's a big, hulking sort of guy, which would be intimidating if he wasn't such a giant teddy bear. He likes to hug me when I come into work. To be honest, I don't mind it as much as I should. If he was anyone, and I mean anyone else, well, he'd be on my death list. But something about the way he laughs and his eyes sparkle. If I liked people, then I'd like him. Officer Intimidating Mustache took in each of my co-workers in turn, pausing only for a moment on me. I guess I'm not overly noticeable. I don't mind it. He paused a little when he got to Eric, I noticed, and I found myself nodding almost imperceptibly. I mean, if I had to pick a murderer, that's probably who I'd choose. Oh, right. The murderers. 2 is a coincidence. 3 is a trend. 4 brings the cops. It was a strange case, and the cops looked a combination of awkward and bewildered as they stood there, questioning my stammering boss in the dim light of our office. See, when you're trying to catch a serial killer, you look for similarities, right? There's usually something that connects the victims. Maybe they're all young women. Maybe they all have blonde hair. Maybe they all work in the same neighborhood. Well, all the victims over the past few months had our office number in their recent calls list. I actually remember one of the victims. The 4th victim. The one that brought the cops to our door. He was a regular customer. I guess that's why they finally decided to check us out. His name was Andrew, and fuck, he was a little prick. He was young, entitled, your basic millennial snot-nosed douche. He and his buddies had a bad habit of trashing whatever cabs we sent them, and he'd been warned several times about it. It seemed like I was always the one who got his calls too. He liked to scream, that kid. He was always shouting at me. Unfortunately for him, all it really did was bore me. My boss liked to have the other dispatchers pass trouble calls to me because nothing riles me up. Perks of being me, I guess. After the cops had grilled my boss, they left, the mustached man eyeing Eric with suspicion. I don't think he even noticed. He was too busy on a call, looking exasperated. It wasn't easy to tell when he was frustrated, but if you watched closely, you'd see his eyebrow twitch, and that's what you know. His eyebrow was twitching furiously, and I was glad I wasn't on the other end of that call. Who knows, maybe that unlucky caller would be the next victim. Once the cops were gone, our boss gave a little announcement. The police will probably want to question you guys within the next few days, he said, shifting awkwardly on his feet. You'll be compensated for your time, of course. He stopped short then, as though he didn't know what to say, and turned towards his office, but not before giving me an intense look. Whoa! So he thought I was the murderer? Interesting. I bet I'd be called first. As soon as our boss was in his office and the door shut tight, Shannon and Samantha devolved into quiet gossip, ignoring their ringing phones in favor of hashing out who was the murderer in our midst. I sighed a little to myself, thinking that this was all just a little ridiculous. Of course there was no murderer in our office. The police were grasping for straws. I mean, sure, maybe the calls to our company had something to do with it, but it seemed more likely to me that the culprit was a cabbie rather than a dispatcher. The cops would probably grill all the cabbies first. We'd have to wait our turn. As I was musing over this, George picked up his phone next to me. I only noticed because immediately I heard the screaming over the phone and he sighed, pinching the skin between his eyebrows in irritation, holding the phone away from his ear so he wouldn't go deaf. I could hear the man screeching expletives over the phone, so awful that I actually winced. I gave George a sympathetic look and he snorted a little, amused that I was offering him pity. He was about to interrupt the screamer when, suddenly, the man's voice seethed over the phone, and George froze. I'm going to come on down to that office and beat the shit out of you, you hear me? Oh, George heard him. Everyone in the goddamn office heard him. I saw something in George's demeanor change as soon as those words were hanging in the air. See, it was the eyes. He had these bright, expressive blue eyes. But suddenly, they were dead and flat. His face dropped, as though he had dropped some kind of mask. I'd say he looked dead. But actually, well, he looked like he'd never been alive in the first place. He raised his phone back to his ear and spoke very, very quietly. So quietly that at first I wasn't sure if he was even speaking. Sir, you're at your residence at 942 Clippingham Drive, isn't that right? You're goddamn right I am, and I ordered a cab 15 fucking minutes ago. Sir, continued George, a deceptive calm flooding his voice, I'd advise you to shut the fuck up, you lazy piece of shit. And before you think of opening your shit-spewing mouth again, please remember. And then he paused and looked at me, a strange sort of smile creeping over his face, pulling back to show the glimmering whites of his teeth just a little. I know where you live.